We're asking Professor Suzuki to come and present a little bit of analysis of the 100th anniversary of the Alien Land Law. Mas?
Anyway, thank you everybody for coming out today. It's I didn't really expect so many people to pack the place, but I started hearing from my relatives this morning, and I knew something was up. Anyway, I was asked to speak a little bit about the film and about the Alien Land Law, and I wanted to make a couple comments about the film, and then I'll talk mainly about the Alien Land Law. There are 2 points I just wanted to comment on. The first one was there's a brief mention in the film that most of the Japanese immigrants were from poor farming backgrounds, and then later on there is a mention of how many the large numbers of Japanese who went back to Japan, and I wanted to talk about a little bit about their the impact of that. One of the things I wanted to point out is that the statement that most of the Japanese are from poor farming backgrounds was by and large true up until 1907 when the Gentleman's Agreement was signed. And for those of you who don't know, the Gentleman's Agreement was an agreement between the U.S. and Japan where the Japanese government agreed to limit or end the emigration of Japanese laborers, farm laborers and laborers to the United States. And this came out in the aftermath of an attempt by your very own San Francisco School District to segregate Japanese in the public schools, just as they had done for many years to Chinese. But because of Japan's rising influence, the Japanese government complained, and then actually the President of the United States, then I think it was Theodore Roosevelt, stepped in, and they worked out this agreement where he strong-armed the school district not to segregate the Japanese in schools, but at the same time they limited the laborers. And you could see after 1907, between 1908 and 1924, when the new Immigration Act basically barred all Japanese immigration, you could see the numbers of Japanese laborers and farm laborers and domestics dropped dramatically, and it dropped even more after 1924. There were continuing immigration after that point because there were exceptions made for merchants, students, religious instructors to come to the United States. And so what you can see is that over the years, the people who tended to come to the United States more and more came from a better off occupation and less so from the laboring classes. And one of the things that's interesting, if you note over to the far right, this is 1920 statistics based on the Japanese census of that year, is the Japanese immigrants over time tended to become much more from better off occupations, and were actually more educated also than the average Japanese at that time. One of the reasons for this, in addition to the Gentleman's Agreement that I mentioned, is actually Japan, unlike many nations, had immigration controls. They tried to prevent some of the poorest Japanese from coming to the United States in particular. And I think in this way the Japanese government was trying to, had a very early version of this sort of called model minority ideas. They wanted to distinguish themselves from, say, Chinese immigrants and say, oh, we have a better class of people emigrating. So one of the things, for example, the Japanese government did is you had to put in an equivalent, I think it was of 1,600 yen, which at that time was $800, which might be worth almost $8,000 today, as a bond to ensure that you could come back. And so this, of course, prevented many of the poorest Japanese from actually coming to the United States. The film also mentioned a large number of Japanese returning. You could see in this chart here how the immigration in the white bar picks up dramatically after 1900. But especially after 1907, you see the very large amount of return migration of Japanese immigrants leaving the United States in the black bar down below. And so the net immigration actually between it shrank dramatically. That's the crosshatch, that's the net increase. And then after 1924, you had this net out-migration of Japanese. One of the things about this out-migration is that Japanese who were laborers, non-farm domestics, and farm laborers were more likely to go back to Japan. And this could have been for a number of reasons. One is that those people, many of them did not have family here. Many of them left family they had in Japan, so they might have been more willing to go back. And those of who were single had a much harder time bringing over wives or marrying, and so that might have been added incentive to go back. So one of the things they did, I actually published a paper about this, is that the increase, or part of the so-called success of Japanese in the United States, partly was because the Japanese who came were actually better off in terms of occupation and education than the average Japanese in Japan, partly because the Japanese who went back were those who were less likely to who were those who weren't doing as well in the United States. But to get to the main point about the California Alien Land Law, this was the first land law in the nation, combination of California nativists as the sons and daughters of the Golden West, trade unions, including the California Federation of Labor, and also farm organizations such as the California Grange, helped pass the first statewide alien land law that banned the purchase of land by Japanese immigrants, and actually other Asians, because the wording in the law says aliens ineligible for citizenship, and so that would have been Japanese, Chinese, and a small number of Koreans and South Asians in California at that time. They also could not even lease land for more than 3 years, and there are other restrictions. The land law was copied. The first copy was in Arizona. This is a picture later on, but still some of the attitudes in Arizona. You can see there's a number of other states, Washington, Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico. List goes on, and then a number of states going as late as during World War II, especially some of the states where there were concentration camps, such as Arkansas, Utah, and Wyoming, passed alien land laws. One of the states that did not have, as far as I know, or any census records show any Japanese at all, hardly, was Florida, who I guess it was a popular thing among politicians at that time to be anti-immigrant, so this was an easy way to do it since it would have virtually no impact. But I'll get back to the curious case of Florida right at the end. Now, there were a number of loopholes in the law. Interesting enough, historian Roger Daniels, who's one of the major historians of Japanese Americans in the United States, he actually argues that this was intentional, that the politicians wanted to look like they were doing something when in fact they left fairly significant loopholes. And so there was a ballot initiative in 1920 that was actually in part backed by California Senator James Phelan, who was running for re-election. And this is actually, it was in the movie also, this is a campaign poster by Phelan in 1920. And actually it doesn't show it here, but his campaign slogan in 1920 was "Keep California White." And he lost the election. The slogan seems to have lost out too. And ironically, if any of you have been to City College, the official address of City College, does anyone know what street City College in San Francisco? It's on Phelan Avenue. And of course, if any of you have been to City College, I was there many, many years ago, and even then there were large numbers of Asians. I'm pretty sure it's a majority Asian now, so if Senator Phelan ever came back, I'd want to take him on a tour of City College, show him how successful he's been. A number of academics have actually argued that the alien land laws, including the 1921, did not have much influence among historians. Robert Bodell, and also was also cited by Roger Daniels, based on Bodell's study of the growth of Japanese farming in Los Angeles County. This argument was also made by an economist, Robert Hicks, who's pictured here, who claimed that the alien land law had no lasting effect on Japanese farming because of the market competition under capitalism would tend to eliminate discrimination. But I actually wrote a paper rebutting Higgs' argument, and this is, I don't know if it's that clear. shows some of what happened. You can see between 1920 and 1930, the total number, or the percentage of acreage held by Japanese dropped by almost half. The value of their farm, land, and buildings dropped by 40%, and the overall average value also went from being slightly higher than the total to significantly lower. And then what you see from 1930 to 1940 is sort of a stabilization in terms of Japanese American agriculture. And I think a large part of this was due to the growing number of Issei who were able to help own land. In fact, my father, who's here, mentioned that one of the things that there was evidently a cottage industry of trying to find Issei who would be willing to buy land, be given the money by Issei farmers and buy the land and hold the title, and so everything was legal, but they wouldn't have to do any farming. So evidently he was approached about that. So my own view is that because of the significant drop, that the 1920 Alien Land Law in particular did have a big and negative effect on Japanese agriculture. Another argument made is that, well, okay, there was a big impact of the land law, but maybe this was because of the big agricultural depression during the 1920s. I don't know if all of you are aware, but actually even before the Great Depression started in 1929, America in general, the economy was in a boom, but agriculture actually suffered a big setback in the 1921 recession following World War I, and it never really recovered. It was in a depression throughout the 20s, and then things just went from bad to worse, of course, in the 30s. This is a picture of a farm foreclosure in the 1920s where the land and building and all the implements are being auctioned off. I also tried to address this argument by arguing two things. California as a whole and Japanese farming in particular were not as affected by the agricultural depression. There was a boom and bust in nationwide in U.S. agriculture due to World War I, but California's agriculture also suffered a boom, but a lot of it was mainly for the domestic market, growing a lot of fruits and nuts and other stuff, not things like wheat and pigs that were pork that was exported. And Japanese immigrant farming was even more concentrated among fruits and vegetables, and their prices fell only half as much, for example, in the 1920s as the nation as a whole. So I don't think Japanese did suffer from the agricultural depression, but it doesn't explain why they did so much worse than other farmers, mainly white farmers, if their prices and products were actually holding up better. There were a number of legal challenges to the Alien Land Law. Went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Unfortunately, between 1923 and 1925, the Supreme Court, in a number of decisions, actually 5 of them, upheld the constitutionality of the Alien Land Law. The end finally came in 1952, where the California Supreme Court overruled the Alien Land Law, and then later, of course, the 1952 McCarran Act lifted the ban on naturalization. Up until that time, Japanese, like Chinese and other Asians, were not able to naturalize and become U.S. citizens, so they were aliens by law. And later in 1956, the California Proposition 13 overturned the state's alien land law. So basically, even though the Supreme Court had said this is not constitutional, you can't enforce it, but there's many unconstitutional things that are still on the books. So the 1956 proposition basically took the law off the books. And basically every state in the country has repealed their alien land laws except for Florida. And I just learned this. I was on a speaking trip in Florida, and they asked me about it beforehand, and I did a little research. And actually there was a ballot initiative in 2008 to basically strip the to strip the alien land law from their, it was actually in their state constitution, it wasn't just a law. And in order to change the constitution, they needed 2/3 vote, but to me, embarrassingly enough for Florida, the initiative to remove the alien land law did not even get a majority of votes in Florida. 52% of Florida voters voted against the ballot initiative, leaving Florida with the only state with an alien land law in the books. Now I want to note, because of the U.S. Supreme Court, it's not, and also because there are no aliens ineligible for citizenship, it's not enforceable against anyone, but to me the fact that the voters there refused to take it off the books says there's still some work to be done. And this may have been true, it may have been in part due to sort of some more general anti-immigrant thinking in Florida, that this would somehow lift restrictions on undocumented immigrants from buying land, when in fact there is no limitation on undocumented immigrants buying land. In fact, it was interesting, during the housing boom, a number of banks rolled out special mortgages for basically aimed at undocumented immigrants, so you didn't have to actually show like a social security number or something like that. And one of the interesting things about it is, because of course the banks wanted extra financial documentation, since you lack some other documentation, those mortgages actually did better on average than most of the mortgages they were issuing to legal residents of the U.S., where they weren't asking for, you could get mortgages where they didn't ask you about how much, well, they asked you how much you made, but you didn't have to show any proof. You just signed a line, oh, I made $100,000, or I made $300,000, or I made $500,000. You could say whatever you want. You didn't have to show a tax form. You didn't have to show anything at all. So anyway, and these are just, sorry, this is some of the reference and stuff. So anyway, I think I kept to my time, so I wanted to thank you all again, and I think there'll be a question and answer later. So save your questions. Thank you very much.